Chapter 9, A New Nation. America begins. The beginning of the new Union in 1776 began, with some issues. The Constitutional Congress asked colonies to draft state constitutions. Some updated their charters, others made new, but basically, most of them created something very similar to what they had previously. The common features of most of these state constitutions were that fundamental laws could not be changed. But the big thing is that all of them contain bills of rights. And bills of rights are basically where you outline the rights that the government cannot take away from you. Annually elected legislators were also a very common feature, following along the tradition of the House of Burgesses, town hall meetings, etc. All of these states created weak executive and judicial branches, giving power to the people through legislative bodies. And this is quite intentional because legislatures are the most direct form of representation. Rather than having an executive like a president, governor, mayor, who can just make unilateral decisions based on what he wants to do. By not having a strong executive, it is the people that are elected from the people and the body of people that have control over the government. As far as across the states, many western districts are enfranchised, meaning that many frontiersmen were given the right to vote, even though they may not have owned property, which had previously been a requirement in many states. And some capitals of states even moved further west, away from the coast, again, representing that we had a much more democratic government than previously existed. Land became cheap as states had seized land owned by the crown and from those who had been loyalists. And this created an economic democracy where people who previously could not own property now saw it more accessible, especially since a lot of the wealthy, large landowners had left. Independence, however, brought many issues to America. We'll talk more about Britain in a little bit, but Britain did not treat us very nicely in our first several years of existence. They intentionally disrupted our trade, dumped cheap goods in America. Remember, we had those non-importation agreements, which stopped them from being able to sell to America. And they also disrupted the fishing that they had promised in the Treaty of Paris. So they made life hard on Americans. And it didn't help that in our own country, our states also had some issues. States owed massive debts to other bodies outside of our country and also to creditors inside of our country. So these massive debts made a lot of them print money to try to pay it off, creating runaway inflation. This means that any money you previously owned, if it was a currency, lost its value rather quickly, and thus causing many issues for people. Unfortunately, this also left many profiteers, or those who had found questionable means of getting money, as our new wealthy class. And when you have that wealthy class making those decisions, those who had made their wealth through shady means, they're probably not going to do what's best for the nation, rather what will make them more money, regardless of any victims. Then finally, one major issue that America faces in our first several years is when you have a revolution based upon pushing against any taxes that are created, and unfortunately, I don't know why that bar didn't disappear, but and based upon disrespect for authority and laws in general, that's just not a good framework for starting a country, because your government will be undermined by people carrying that attitude. No matter how justified the new government is, they expect that they will be able to push against and create chaos whenever they see fit to make sure taxes don't get paid. So here's a list of all the different times that America had been organized into one specific union. You can look at that at your leisure. It's not the most exciting chart, but it does show you that we had slowly developed more and more of the unity over time, ending with the final federal constitution. But you'll notice we do have a system of government, the Articles of Confederation, before we get to what is today our government, the Constitution. So where did the Articles of Confederation come from? Well, the Second Continental Congress that met in 1775 declared independence in 1776. They had no real constitutional authority. They were simply, they had some control over our military and foreign policy, but had no legal authority over the states. And since the states were not very kind to cooperate with each other during and even after the war, that led to some issues. So some of the things they clashed on were their own coin money. So if you lived in Pennsylvania and tried to go to New York and spend some Pennsylvania currency, they would not accept it. And same thing from New York to New Jersey and other states. So they refused to collaborate as far as working with each other's currencies. They also wouldn't support each other with their individual armies and navies. Then finally, they even created tariff barriers. So if you tried to sell a good from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts, they would charge a tax as though you were a foreign country. So you see all these economic barriers between the states. Um, Despite these challenges, we do have our first, I guess you could call it a government, but the Articles of Confederation were adopted by Congress in 1777, but they weren't ratified until 1781 as our official governing document. Approval, of course, held off until agreements were made in handling Western lands, which we'll get to in just a second. But the Articles of Confederation are created, but as you can tell, the states refuse to cooperate. So what is the Articles of Confederation exactly? Well, it is a loose confederation. That's what the term actually means, is a firm league or friendship. You have 13 very independent states. They operate individually, and as we saw from the last slide, they almost compete against one another. They intentionally did not have an executive branch, so no president, no king, nobody who could tell the states what to do or make any individual decisions. And this was, again, this was intentional because they had grown tired of the king and parliament telling them what to do. So without an executive branch, each state would be able to do what they wanted. The only force of this government, the Articles of Confederation, was Congress. But the problem was each state only had one vote. And if you wanted to pass a bill, 9 of the 13 states had to agree to it. And if you wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, you had to have unanimous support from all the states. So consider today to pass a law, you have 2 bodies in Congress, and you only need a majority, so over 50% in both houses. That is much smaller than the 9 votes. And even if the president vetoes a bill today, you still only have to get a 2/3 agreement in the houses of Congress. So in order to add an amendment, you also only need 3/4 of all states to ratify it. So it is significantly easier than it was now than it was to pass laws and amendments in the Articles of Confederation period. But the biggest issues of the Articles was that they could not regulate commerce. They had no way to stop New York from bullying the states around them, Virginia from bullying the states around them. They also could not protect themselves from international interference for our commerce, trading with other countries. And that's because the second major weakness is they could not enforce tax collection. Taxes were supposed to be given voluntarily. Imagine someone asking you to volunteer to pay your taxes. I can almost guarantee you the vast majority of us would not pay taxes if it was on a voluntary basis. And so without being able to collect taxes, they couldn't have a significant army or navy, and thus any enforcement and protection fell upon the states to handle, which means, well, that lack of cooperation between the states kept us from being able to do anything we really needed to. In other words, Congress could advise, advocate, and appeal, but they could not coerce or force or control states or individuals in any way possible. This was a weak government, and it was intended to be weak, as we know from our reaction to the British government. So what did it actually do well? Despite its flaws, it did unite the 13 states and proved to be an important transition to the Constitution. No states leave the Union. They do keep us unified. So even though it is a weak form of government, at least it did unify us and begin that transition. Its greatest success, beyond simply creating a country that doesn't fall apart, its greatest success comes in the handling of westward expansion, especially in the Old Northwest. You look at this map, the Old Northwest are those dark green states, or eventual states there: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan in clockwise direction. Anyways, so the 2 major laws that helped set up this process of westward expansion were the Land Ordinance Act of 1785. 1785 set up a process to sell land to pay the national debt off. So first, if you go back to this map, we see that land of the West had to be given up by Virginia, by Kentucky, or excuse me, by New York, Connecticut. They have to give up their claims to this land so the nation can prosper. So somehow the Articles, out of all the things it fails to do, is able to get them to agree upon that. So that land is given up to help pay off the national debt together. They divide it into townships, and they use the money that they raise not only to pay our debts off, but one of those you can see in the under the 7 ranges first area surveyed. You see a township. The 16th little square in the larger squares, all that money that land sold for was to pay for public education, which is pretty cool because the South doesn't have public education till nearly 80 years later. So these northwestern states have education from early on. You also have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So these 2 laws, these 2 ordinances, set up not only the process for selling land and creating western movement, but it also creates a process for colonies and territories to go from property to states with equal power. So once one of these territories got 60,000 inhabitants, they had to create their own state constitution. They would apply to Congress, and then if Congress approved, they would be admitted as a state. Now, what's amazing about this is once they are admitted as a state, they have equal power with previous states. They're not considered a new territory, or they're not considered a weaker, almost colony of the original states. Rather, they are welcomed as an equal member of the Union, which is quite impressive and a great idea that is continued to be implemented today. Another big thing about this is the Northwest Territory also has slavery forbidden. Now, you may think maybe that's because we were finally forward-thinking and progressive, but unfortunately, a lot of this was just the idea of if we don't allow slavery, that encourages more Western movement and provides economic incentive and opportunity for our citizens already living in America. So this was not necessarily a moral act, although it does look good looking back. It was more about economic opportunity. So one last time, the one success of the Articles of Confederation is how we divide our territory to the west. We work together to sell it to help pay off debt, and we set up a process for future expansion and how territories can become states. Now, all of this brings us back to the challenges we're facing under the Articles, which is international affairs were not good. Britain was excessively cruel to us, as we'll see through the next few chapters. They continue to enforce the navigation laws, even though we're not their colonies anymore. They close us off from the West Indies trade. They hold U.S. trading posts in the Northwest. You can see in the Michigan areas around the Great Lakes, those blue dots are forts where the British encouraged and supported Indian raids. They had promised to pull their soldiers out of there under the Treaty of Paris, but they refused to do so. They also refused to let us have a minister to them, or basically a diplomat, a foreign representative, which tells us that they had no intention of upholding their bargains to treat us nicely, and their hopes were that we would collapse and they would come back and take us over. And then I have Spain. Spain cuts off the Mississippi River to U.S. commerce, claims land north of the Gulf, and as you can see on this map again, they push Native American and support Native American raids and attacks against us as well. So two major powers are being mean to us, and then you have France. France is supposed to be our friends, but instead, because Britain had been humbled and lost their North American empire, France just shrugs their shoulders and doesn't care for us. Instead, they leave us to, well, suffer in our early stages of existence. And then with no navy to speak of, and with no protection from the British Navy, North African pirates ravage our commerce in the Mediterranean. So our international trade is also being beset by challenges, not only by the British, but pirates as well. So a lot of struggles internationally, and then we also have struggles domestically. With the economic issues that we were facing, no taxes being collected, debt escalating, states decided that they would collect taxes but wouldn't give it to the federal government to help support the federal government because they themselves had their own taxes. Because of these economic conditions, these states do that they will begin foreclosing on land, on people who can't pay their taxes, and then selling it off to pay off their debts. So you have a man named Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays is a former Revolutionary War veteran who was a farmer himself, and he rallies all these impoverished farmers who are losing their land to foreclosure, and they all refuse to pay taxes. When the government tries to force them to pay taxes, Daniel Shays and this large group decide to shut down the Massachusetts court system. They just straight up refuse to let court convene through force. They demand paper money, lighter taxes, and they demand their land be given back. So the Massachusetts governor, because there is no national government that can, and national military force that can stop it, has to raise a state militia, much of which came from his own pocketbooks, and they're able to stop the rebellion. Now, what's blocked out by my unfortunate bar at the bottom of my computer is the fact that despite the defeat of Shays' militia, they actually pass debtors' forgiveness, and many of these men actually get their land back. And they lower taxes. So the funny thing is, while this was a mob, they are able to force the government to bend to their will. So what this causes is many people to look back at this event, especially our leaders in that day. You have Abigail Adams calling the Shayites ignorant, restless desperados without conscience or principles, mobbish insurgents who are for sapping the foundation of the young government. George Washington himself said, "We probably had too good opinion of human nature in forming our confederation." So both of them look at this and say, we gave a lot of power to the people, and unfortunately, we are now beholden to the mob. If they want to throw a fit, we can do nothing to stop them. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson, being who he is, says the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. In other words, this is good. People need to do whatever they can to limit the power of tyrants over the people. With that said, most leaders in America recognize that people value their own self-interest more than civic virtue or caring for the greater good, if you will. It also struck a fear in the wealthy and leading class of people in our country, like Washington, the Adams, the Hamiltons, the Edmund Randolphs. They recognized there was a need for a stronger central government, because if you cannot handle even one single mob, if one mob can shut down the court system and make you repeal taxes and basically drive you further into debt and chaos, that is an issue. Now, some historians say that these ideas and these events were exaggerated and that they weren't as serious as they actually were because the economy actually improves in the late 1780s. But both friends and critics agreed that the government needed more strength. The problem is how much power should that government be given, because you don't want it to be overbearing. So we have a meeting called the Annapolis Convention in 1786 to discuss the commercial disputes between states. So since financially we're not working, 9 states choose to send delegates, but only 5 show up. And this is where Alexander Hamilton plays a key part, because if only 5 out of 13 states show up, that's not really a call to action. However, he's able to write letters from the ideas discussed by those 5 states, and his letters are able to convince these states to send representatives to Philadelphia in 1787. So Congress agrees to this call for a meeting for the sole and express purpose of revising the articles. Now, the idea is that they're only going to create amendments to add on. This is not going to create a new government. However, when the representatives get there, they realize that we would be better off with a brand new government. So in some ways, you could consider this a separate revolution from the first revolutionary movement, because no authority had been given to them to create a new government. Yet, what happens? The articles are basically thrown in the trash, and we have the authoring of the Constitution. So 55 men from 12 states meet in Philadelphia on May 25th, 1787. All of them well-to-do, experienced statesmen, lawyers, merchants, shippers, moneylenders. Some of the leading figures we will recognize are Washington, Franklin, Hamilton, and James Madison. Of course, you have Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine, 3 revolutionary leaders. They're actually in Europe at the time. And other revolutionary leaders did not attend, whether they're like Adams and Hancock, not chosen by their states to represent them, or whether it's men like Patrick Henry, who viewed this as a suspicious attempt by the elites to get more power over the people and a stronger centralized government to control the states. So not everyone bought into it. And this is where James Madison, who we have yet to mention up to this point in our history, he is the surprising star of the Constitutional Convention. He is called the father of the Constitution because of his role in the creation and ratification of it. So he takes a lot of notes, he brings a lot of ideas to the table, and because of his influence, he grows in stature politically and will eventually be our 4th president. So what are the ideas behind the Constitution? What is the driving force behind it? Most wanted to simply stabilize the national government at the expense of state governments and popular democracy. They realized that the central government needed to be able to handle interstate commerce and control tariffs to secure commercial treaties, not only between our nation and others, but also between the states. So financially, that's a big focus. How do we handle the issues between our states that are dividing us economically? And then how do we also take power out of the mobs and make sure that our government can create a stable nation? Unfortunately, this also does mean that state governments will have to give up some power to the federal government. Even today, we have the debate over whether that's true or not, but we see that the national government does gain power over states. I want you to notice the word I have in quotes there. The founding fathers, or many of them at this Constitutional Convention, feared the power of the mobocracy. In other words, the mobs rising up, emotionally angry and turbulent. Their unrestrained democracy was leading us into anarchy, as we can see in Shays' Rebellion. So most of all, what these men wanted is to keep the nation united, protect from foreign interference, and safe from rebellion. So what do they do in the meeting to create this new country? Well, you have a few different compromises. The first compromise comes from the large and small states. So naturally, large states wanted a bicameral or 2-chamber household, and they wanted both of those chambers to be selected in Congress based upon representation. or rather population. They wanted larger states with the larger population to have more representation. Well, naturally, small states like New Jersey says that's not fair. How about just one body that is just equally represented? No matter your population, all states are equal. So luckily, Roger Sherman arises with his idea that is later called the Great Compromise. And this is where we get our House today. Our House of Representatives is made up based upon population, and our second house of Congress is called the Senate, in which each state has 2 representatives, and thus each state is equal. By having all bills have to go through both houses, every state is treated equally, with the larger states having somewhat of an advantage since all tax bills and revenue measures have to originate in the House, where population counts most. Other things put in there, delegates agreed U.S. needed sound money, which will come later in Hamilton's economic plan, protect private property, 3 government branches help each other with checks and balances. We do create an executive branch in this government led by the president. We also create a judicial branch known as the Supreme Court, and we also can create amendments to the Constitution through just 3/4 of states' approval rather than unanimous. I also desire protection from the mobocracy, a key phrase that you'll see me throw out there. There's no universal suffrage granted to anyone. Instead, it was limited. Federal judges also serve for life. That way they're not being constantly changed, and that allows a long-term control by those people. And then the president and senators are chosen indirectly. So they did limit the power of democracy. That's why we're a republic and not a democracy, because power is not granted directly to the people in the initial electoral college and the choosing of senators. The second major compromise came when it came down to slavery. While the delegates recognized the immorality of slavery, there still was a debate about whether or not they should count for representation. Northern states which lacked slavery did not think slaves should be counted for representation, but of course the South disagrees. So the question is, if you have millions of people that are considered property, why on earth should they count as representatives for your congressional power? After a long debate, this is the one that took the longest to agree upon, they come to the agreement that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for representation. They also agreed that the slave trade would end in 1807. So with this final compromise in mind, the convention comes to a close, but the debate continues over all these things. So when the Constitution goes out to the rest of the states for ratification, you can see that the coastal areas where the elites were mostly located, they supported the idea of the Constitution. They supported it because this would create a more stable nation. On the frontiersmen, or on the frontier where you have people who were, more independent-minded and fought against the elites, we see a different attitude forming, and that's where your anti-federalists would be. So although the Constitution cheated the Article's unanimous requirement, they still needed 9 states to get it ratified. Federalists pushed for strengthening the government through this new Constitution, whereas anti-federalists opposed it. As I mentioned just a second ago, Federalists were wealthy, educated, mostly lived on the coast, and were much better organized because of their wealth and power. Anti-Federalists, however, believed that this would be a violation of states' rights, that people's rights would be limited as well through this new federal government. And they were mostly located in the backcountry. Many were farmers and, of course, debtors who felt the victims of the elites. Federalists end up winning out. As states call individual conventions to vote, small states quickly accepted. And you can understand why small states would, because they felt hurt by the way that representation worked. And they knew that having the Senate and equal representation of states would help them a lot. Pennsylvania also soon follows along. Massachusetts, however, only passes it after Federalists agree to create a Bill of Rights. Now, one interesting thing about the Constitution itself, before we add the first 10 amendments called the Bill of Rights, is that no rights were actually guaranteed to Americans through the Constitution. It was simply an outlining of how our government would function. And so without this promise to give the rights to people, many were worried that the federal government would have too much power. But through this promise, Massachusetts passes it, and then 3 other states quickly follow. Despite the fact that 4 states are outside of it, the nation is set to begin. So to convince the remaining states, New York ends up being convinced by papers written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay called the Federalist Papers. They're able to argue successfully that the federal system under the Constitution would be much more successful for everyone and made more sense than the Articles did. So after New York decides to join, the individualistic Rhode Island, North Carolina hold out until 1789 and mid-1790, and that's because they were waiting on a Bill of Rights and that agreement to be held up. So that brings us to what was going on in the minds of Americans throughout this time period. Well, equality was naturally on everyone's mind. Most states reduced property qualifications for voting, granting more people the right to vote and control over how our nation would be run. Employers also asked to stop being called master, or rather people refused to call them master. Ordinary people demanded to be called Mr. and Mrs. rather than just the landed elites. And then groups like the Society of Cincinnati, which were wealthy landowners, were ridiculed. Separation of church and state also became quite popular. It begins with the Anglican Church being disestablished because that was a prop of kingly authority. And so they removed the idea of the Anglican Church and quit paying their taxes to help keep it up. Thomas Jefferson helps lead this charge in Virginia and other states by creating the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, stopping them from having to pay taxes to any church body. So what about slavery? After all, if this is all about the equality of all men and that all men are treated equally, as Jefferson wrote, why doesn't slavery disappear? So some states do begin pushing to get rid of slavery. Pennsylvania Quakers are among the first to form anti-slavery societies in 1775, and many northern states call for abolition, and many also pass laws that provide for gradual emancipation. However, the U.S. was not, sadly, ready to end slavery. The slave trade continues to grow all the way till 1807, and even after we end the international slave trade in the following year, you still have an internal slave trade. The North only gradually ended slavery. They did not declare an immediate end. And then finally, no southern states ended it. So why did they not end it? Well, they gave up the idea of ending this evil establishment simply because it was a political expediency. That means that it was convenient. If they had demanded that slavery end, we may not have had a union to begin with, and the southern states may not have agreed to stay in the United States because of it. So fighting over slavery would have just dissolved the union, and so that forces us sadly to hold on to slavery for way too long. And that brings us to women's role in the new nation. So Abigail Adams argued for women's equality, demanding that her husband, quote, remember the ladies. And in it you see that she says that all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So while that was a little tongue-in-cheek from Abigail Adams, her demand to remember the ladies for her husband was one of the early moments where women began to stand up for themselves. New Jersey's constitution actually gave women the right to vote for a while, but was done away with 1800. So we see some movement for women's rights. Overall, however, the role for women in the early American Republic is the idea that women are meant to stay in the home and raise the next generation. This is called Republican motherhood. And while in today's mindset, maybe we think this is a weak role for women, and maybe justifiably so, they were entrusted with moral education. The idea was that men are off to work to provide for the household, but it's women who have the most, at least they would have said it, the most important job of making sure that our children are raised to have a conscience and to have the morals to create a great nation. If we don't have good children taught in the right way, then we won't have a successful country. And so Republican motherhood represents women's importance to society by raising a successful generation of children who will uphold the common good over their own selfish desires. Women were also given educational opportunities, which brings us to Judith Sargent Murray. Judith Sargent Murray is a woman who believed that women were given some educational opportunities, but these educational opportunities were not equal. In fact, at a certain age, men continued to learn things like math and science, whereas women instead were diverted into sewing and how to cook. And she found that this is why women were not equal to men, not because they are unable, but rather because they had limited educational opportunities. So women like Abigail Adams and Judith Sargent Murray are two of your earliest women who pushed for equality for all women across America. So that is the end of this chapter, chapter 9, showing what early American government looked like, the failure of the Articles of Confederation to hold our nation together, and then the creation of a brand new government known as the Constitution. Unfortunately, there are flaws in how that government was created, including not getting rid of slavery or providing equality for women. But it was a good start in heading towards America, where America needed to go as far as keeping itself together financially and protecting ourselves from the mob. So, with all that said, that wraps up chapter 8, or excuse me, chapter 9. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.